he wrote a critique of Hegel, in which he wrote, "Democracy is the secret of all constitutions." That was as far as he was able to go in 1843, in terms of defining what the centre of the solution of politics was, in a sense. 1850, after the experience of the 1848 revolutions, Marx is able to be more concrete. He writes I've got the name of the work, one of his addresses to the Central Committee in 1850. He writes, when he's developing first developing the ideas of permanent revolution, or the revolution in permanence, as he called it. He writes about the need for, that he's learned from the 1848 revolution, the need for independent working class organisation, by which he doesn't simply mean party, it's undefined, but he says we need independent working class organisation. He talks about the need for workers in the next revolution to form their own independent working class militias and so on. And he uses the phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. 1871 is another advance for Marx with the Paris Commune. Marx says, the workers of Paris have shown the political form in which the emancipation of labour can occur. And communists probably know something about this. He talks about a body made up of recallable delegates. He talks about those holding public office not receiving any privileges. He talks about all public offices being elected and so on, as if the workers of Paris have shown the way. If you look at the Paris Commune, you have also to say that by 20th century standards, it's really a very backward organisation. Several features. Paris, of course, was not a city of mighty industry in 1871. It was a city of tiny workshops. I think the average number of workers in each workplace was 7. They're not exactly talking about a city of great factories. Most of the measures of the Paris Commune, if you actually look at the history of what the Paris Commune achieved, most of the measures which it carried out were not actually specifically working class measures. And in fact, less than a third of the members of the Paris Commune were actually workers. The people who were elected, less than a third of them were actually workers. Now, after the Paris Commune, after about the time of the Paris Commune, in the last part of the 19th century, and then of course continuing in the 20th century, there's an absolutely huge development of capitalism in the world. From really what, in the 19th century, you have to say, from a 20th century perspective, you have to say the 19th century capitalism was extremely puny. It was really only starting in terms of what we know today. It's after 1870 that you get the great industrialization of the United States, you get the industrialization of Germany, France, industrialization begins in Japan, industrialization begins in Tsarist Russia. And it's after the Paris Commune that we really enter the period of modern capitalism, the era of imperialism, of the growth of state involvement in the development of capitalism in the 20th century, directly state capitalism. It's also the period, since 1871, the period of huge development of capitalist technology as the means of production and the means of destruction on a mass scale, which is characteristic of modern capitalism. It's in the 20th, late 19th and early 20th century that we have the huge fusions of industry and finance and the state. Ours is the epoch after 1871, it's the epoch really of mass wars, of world crises, and so on. Now it's also that era, the era of imperialism, as many call it, is also the era, our era, of mass workers' movements, of mass strikes. Marx never experienced mass strike, in the sense that we can see them in the history of working class movement in the 20th century. Mass movements of workers, mass parties, mass trade unions, and so on. All this is after the Paris Commune. Equally, our era is the era of the development of the trade union bureaucracy, of great reformist parties, of workers getting the vote. I mean, Britain didn't become a democracy in any real sense, bourgeois democracy, in fact, in the 20th century. The majority of workers in practice didn't have a vote until after 1918. And of course, women workers didn't get, no women working in this country had, no woman in this country had a vote until after 1918. It's in the modern period that we see the roots of modern reformism being laid with that institutional separation between politics, the business of the social democratic parties, and economics, the business of trade unions. Now, I mention all this because really for the modern era, the era of the late 19th and 20th century, really it's not likely, if you think about it, that the artisan form of democracy, which was developed by the Paris Commune, is going to be suitable as a suitable form for the emancipation of the modern working class in the 20th century. for the taste of the proletariat in the 20th century, the 21st. Now, I think it's fair that everybody will have some sort of awareness that it's beginning in 1905, in the Russian Revolution in 1905, that we see the emergence of a new form which is being developed by workers, a new political form for the emancipation of labour developed by workers in the shape of the Soviet. Now, the word Soviet, in some ways I wish this talk wasn't called Soviet because it makes it sound as if we're talking about something foreign. And Soviet is a Russian word, it simply means council. And really, this talk is about the Workers' Council, which is all that the word Soviet means. Now, the development of the Soviet, or the Workers' Council, was a crucial breakthrough. And it had at least two characteristics, which I think is worth just our noting. The first one is that it took quite a while for Marxists, revolutionary Marxists, to recognise the significance of what happened. It's a famous story from the 1905 revolution that when the Petrograd workers formed the Soviet, the Bolshevik party's attitude initially to the Soviet was to go along to them and say, do you accept the Bolshevik program, if not, get stuck. I mean, you can imagine how taking the same sort of attitude to a strike. You know, you go along to some local strike and say, do you accept the complete program of the Socialist Workers' Party? If not, you're wasting your time, really. That was a completely, that ultimately attitude was initially adopted by the Bolsheviks. If you look at the writings of Marxists reflecting on the experience of the 1905 revolution, Luxemburg, writing The Mass Strike, it's a marvellous description of the movement of workers in 1905 in Russia and Poland and so on. She has nothing to say about the Soviet. The experience of the Soviet does not appear with any importance in Rosa Luxemburg's pamphlet. Trotsky, who'd been the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, nonetheless did not generalize in his theory of permanent revolution specifically to the Soviet as the new form for the emancipation of labour. Lenin doesn't really make all that much of the Soviet in 1905. He doesn't continue in his writings from 1905 to 1917. You don't find him in 1912 writing about the Soviet and trying to generalize them. It's only in 1917, when the Soviet is recreated by the Russian workers, that in a sense the experience is fully consolidated, begins to be fully consolidated into our theory. It's very often the case that Marxism lags behind we learn from workers as much as we teach, and that's very much the case in relation to this question. Now, the other central point I can say about Soviets is, of course, the Soviet, the Workers' Council form, was absolutely at the centre of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And despite the ultimate defeat of the Workers' Council system in Russia, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution is another way of saying the same thing, the defeat of the Workers' Councils in Russia, through all the things that have been talked about in other meetings, and which everyone will know something about. The form, that form, the Workers' Council form, we see it re-emerging time and time again in every significant revolutionary workers' struggle in different parts of the world. In Germany in 1919, the Workers' Council is central to the process of the German Revolution. In Hungary in 1919, the Workers' Council. In Seattle, in the state of Washington, general strike in January 1919, the beginning of the formation of a Workers' Council, which I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment. In Italy, in the Turin factories, the development of the Factory Council, the Workers' Council form, again emerging in the struggle in Italy. In Spain in 1936-37, workers' and peasants' councils are central to the organisation of the left, the organisation of the workers in the Spanish Revolution. In Hungary and Poland in 1956, the Workers' Council form is recreated by the workers. In Chile in 1972 in particular, I've forgotten what the organisation was called for the moment, I should have written it down, I never remember things when I'm speaking. Again, workers in the working class districts start recreating effectively the Workers' Council form in the working class districts in Santiago and elsewhere. In Portugal, the form begins to emerge again in the mid-70s for a brief period, the height of the revolutionary movement in Portugal. And in Poland in 1980, what do the workers create? In Gdansk, at the high point of their movement, they create a body called the Inter-Factory Strike Committee. And if you want to know what another way of saying Inter-Factory Strike Committee is, it's Soviet. Only, of course, the Polish workers never knew that. And unfortunately, there were no real communists around in Poland to tell them. Indeed, I think we have to say that you can treat the extent to which there is the development of the Workers' Council form in a workers' movement as a measure of the extent to which there is a revolutionary situation developing in a particular country. Now, what is a Workers' Council? What's a Soviet? What's does it mean? What does the term mean? And what's its significance? The basic form, the cell form, if you like, around which every other aspect of workers' councils develops, I think, is, because of course there are soldiers' councils and peasants' councils and so on, associated with the notion of the subject. This central form is a body of delegates, of elected delegates from workplaces. And the first feature is that it links workers together in different industries and different trades and different factories in a common struggle. That they've got some pressing issue which unites them in a new kind of organisation which brings them together, regardless of trade and industry. In Poland, somebody made the point, one of the members of the ruling class made the point that railway workers and fashion designers were in the same organisation, and it was a fantastic, and one of the things that the regime sought to do is to separate them, make it quite clear to railway workers they ought not to want to be in the same organisation as fashion designers. The strength of the Workers' Council is that it unites workers from all sorts of different industries. That's the first feature. The second is that it poses, from its beginning, political as well as economic demands. And thirdly, that it has, of course, the reason for our excitement with the idea of the Workers' Council is that the Workers' Council has got the potential to move forward to be the institution through which workers can come to control the whole of society. In other words, it can be the basis of working class power, or the workers' state, and so on. Now, let's be quite clear, when we talk about the Workers' Council, we're talking about an organisation always of mass struggle. Workers' councils don't exist except in the context of mass struggle, of mass strikes, of movements which combine and fuse together politics and economics. Normally under capitalism, it's part of the strength of capitalism. If capitalism survives, politics is separated from economics. The Workers' Council fuses them together. Because the Workers' Council is based in the workplace, it's based in the collective strength of workers at the point of production. And that collective strength which workers have, greater or lesser degree, all the time within capitalism, is turned into politics. It's built from the ground up. One of the things which always characterises the Workers' Council is a very high degree of working class democracy, by comparison with other forms of working class organisation. The delegates are, in principle, recallable. The delegates, like the delegates in the Paris Commune, in principle, are not privileged, and there is no separation, in principle, of political and economic struggles and political and economic organisation. Now, let's try to define what it is. Let's ask first, is the Workers' Council simply a shop steward organisation? Is it like a strike committee? In some ways, you have to say, yes, there's a connection between a good shop stewards committee or a strike committee and the Workers' Council. The form in some ways is the same, to the extent you've got a really live and active strike committee that's elected and so on, then yes, there's a connection. On the other hand, the strike committee is normally limited to a particular trade, a particular industry, a particular factory. There are elements always in the Workers' Council, on the other hand, that unite workers beyond the immediate particular economic issues they have in their particular industry. Is it a rank and file movement? Like, say, the shop stewards movement in the First World War, in Clydeside, the Clyde Workers' Committee, or the Sheffield Shop Stewards Committee in the First World War. Again, I think we have to say, of course, there are elements in common, but on the other hand, the Workers' Council in its developed form leaps beyond the notion of rank and file organisation, because rank and file organisations tend to be limited to a particular industry. The Workers' Council forms on a geographical and not simply an industrial basis. And it poses political demands in a way that was certainly not true of the Sheffield Shop Stewards Committee, and largely was not true of the Clyde Workers' Committee in the First World War. On the other hand, you have to ask another way. If you ask the question at the other end, it isn't quite like a trade union. On the other hand, if you ask, is the Workers' Council a revolutionary body, directly and inescapably, the answer also is by no means, not necessarily. Whether it becomes so is a matter of politics, but it isn't necessarily immediately a revolutionary body. And very often, you find the first stages in the role of Workers' Councils that the demands of the Workers' Council are a jumble of political and revolutionary demands on the one hand, and the most small-scale economic demands at the same time. Two examples of this. the armed sailors of Kiel, at the end of the First World War, at the beginning of the German Revolution, formed 20,000 armed sailors formed the Kiel Sailors' Council. What were their demands? Firstly, they demanded state power. They said an element of state power, and they said, we demand the right to elect officers. And if you want a central demand from state power, it's the right to control the election of officers. On the other hand, they also said, another of their demands, we demand that personal correspondence between ourselves and our wives and sweethearts should not be censored. There's such a discrepancy between the two levels of demand. Election of officers and no control of censorship, no censorship of our private letters. The Gdansk workers, the famous 21 demands of the shipyard workers in Gdansk. On the one hand, they demand no political prisoners, free trade unions, no censorship. They also have a list of things which they want to be included in the state's list of official industrial diseases. Now, there's a fantastic discrepancy, you might say, between the kinds of demand. That's characteristic of the formation of workers' councils. There's a mixture of kinds of demand, a mixture of forms of organisation, and so on. Now, the other thing about the not necessarily revolutionary character issue of workers' councils is, of course, you have to ask who leads workers' councils. Now, very often the initiative in the formation of workers' councils is taken by the most extreme left. Maybe conscious revolutionaries, maybe, as in Poland, for example, simply the best people around them, people who've been around CORE, the Committee for the Defence of Workers, people like Wałęsa and Anna Valentinowicz and so on, who by no means revolutionaries, but they were the left. They were the people who initiated the formation of the Inter-Factory Strike Committee. But while the left may be, and the revolutionaries may be, the people who, if you like, initiate the formation of the Workers' Council, very often we find rapidly that the people who lead into the leadership of this new body are immediately reformers. The majority of the leaders of Workers' Councils in the first stage of the development of Workers' Councils will turn out to be reformers. When the Workers' Council appears in Birmingham, do not imagine that left trade union leaders are not going to be found very rapidly in the councils of such a body. That reformist conveners from the big factories and so on are not going to be members of the Communist Party, left Labour rights and so on, are not going to be in the leadership of the Workers' Council. They are. Not surprisingly, because although workers' consciousness in a period of revolutionary crisis, and when we're talking about Workers' Councils, we are always talking about a period of potentially revolutionary crisis. Although workers' confidence and consciousness leaps forward with amazing speed, it doesn't leap all the way from complete passivity and reformism and so on instantly into revolutionary politics. It leaps and then it staggers. There's a lot of workers leap forward and lose confidence and wonder where they are and have to regroup and rethink, and it becomes rather important that there's anybody around to discuss with them what's happening, what the significance is, and what the possibilities are in this new situation, and so on and so on. By no means is the change in workers' consciousness an overnight process. On the other hand, the potential for workers' councils, well, the workers' council form is absolutely vast. It is in fact the form in which the world can be politically transformed. And as Lenin wrote in the April 1917 about the Soviets, he said, this of course was when the Soviets were dominated by the Mensheviks and by the social revolutionaries. He wrote about the Soviets, they constitute a new form, or rather a new type of state, realized by the initiative of the nation's millions who are creating a democracy on their own, in their own way. Creating a democracy on their own, in their own way. And that's Lenin's assessment of the possibilities of the Soviet form. It's because of that assessment, of course, that Lenin, on his return to Russia, formulated the demand, all power to the Soviet. Now, how can it happen? I mean, I was asking various comrades yesterday, what do you think comrades want to know about the Soviets? And I was told, is it possible? Is what comrades really want to know. And I think we have to ask, how can it happen that workers' councils are created? I think we have to be clear that always, when you look at the history of a particular workers' council, it may not have been apparent at the time, but always when you look at it, you find there's a background behind, historically, several years behind the emergence of workers' councils, of small struggles, of strikes, rising level of strikes that are sometimes won and sometimes lost and so on, but nonetheless a process in which workers' confidence in small strikes in key industries begins to grow. I'll give you one example from Poland. there were 1,000 strikes in Poland between 1976 and 1980. Now, given that all strikes are officially illegal in Poland, that's quite something. And what's more, many of those strikes were successful. Workers actually won what they demand. In fact, the Polish government was said, there are 49 districts in Poland, the Polish government was said to have a 50th district, economic district, consisting of refrigerated lorries loaded up with meat, ready to rush to the factories to buy off striking workers. Workers had a growing confidence in the period from 1976 to 1980 that on the question they could take the government on, in the big factories at least, and win at least economic demands like better meat supplies and so on. The development, therefore, in that context, of the beginnings of independent rank-and-file organisation in the factories, of workers beginning to sort out a sense of their own strength, beginning formally or informally to develop their own factory organisation, and so on, is always in the background of the emergence of workers' councils. Also true, of course, in 1905 in Russia, it's also true in the 1917 revolution in Russia, and so on. Always, therefore, an element of the development of potential opposition and beginning with rank-and-file opposition to the trade union bureaucracy, to the containment of workers' struggles, and so on. Secondly, of course, there's always a crisis. And there's a crisis in society, which is signalled almost by the emergence of workers' councils, but there's a crisis in the development of workers' own struggles and so on. A qualitative leap is taken from the union form into the workers' council form. There's a sudden shift to a new level of mass organisation and class organisation, which always occurs. Again, this always requires generalisation, it involves generalisation. You cannot unite printers and engineers and fashion designers, let's say. I don't know, we're hooked up on fashion designers, but you can't unite them except on the basis of them having something in common, and that can only be some level of generalisation, some general political and therefore political demand, which brings them together to fight together in a new form. Very often it can be by accident that the Workers' Council is initially created. I mean, the example from Gdansk is an interesting one. The shipyard workers, like many, many other workers in Poland in the summer of 1980, went on strike. After 2 days of their strike in Gdansk, they won all their demands. All the ones that were feasible within the framework of everyone striking one factory. They won. In fact, they had got an agreement with the management, with the local party secretary, and they were going to go back to work. Only there was a woman tram driver who was visiting the shipyard in solidarity with the shipyard workers, because the tram drivers had come out in solidarity with the shipyard workers, and she said, after Wałęsa had announced over the tannoy that the strike was over, she said, "You bastards, if you go back without us, we will get nothing." And Wałęsa, whatever people say about him afterwards, he had one brilliant moment in working class history. He said, "You're right, the strike is on again." Unfortunately, the tannoy had been unplugged by then, they had to rush around and suddenly that night there's a new body created, which now is shipyard workers and tram drivers and workers from a number of other enterprises in Gdansk. Suddenly there is an inter-factory strike committee, and suddenly it's formulating its 21 demands, and the whole thing is lifted up to an entirely new level, and the beginnings of the birth of Solidarność are underway. The whole thing, qualitatively, almost you might say by accident, if there hadn't been one woman tram driver with a map in the Gdansk shipyard at the right place at the right time to put the point, actually solidarity wouldn't have happened. Which is something to bear in mind. I mean, everybody should watch very carefully for women tram drivers. And you get a mixture, and because of the form, the mixture always of economic and political demands is characteristic. Workers fight for a principle, a political principle, in the case of Gdansk free trade unions, in the case of the Russian workers in 1905, the Constituent Assembly, and at the same time for economic demands. I mean, the demands of the provincial Soviets in 1905, according to Anweiler, in the book on the Soviets, for example, were characteristically two demands: the 8-hour day and the Constituent Assembly, an economic demand and a political demand. And they're fused together in the same organisation. They're fighting with one form of organisation for two kinds of demands, which normally under capitalism are separated. How does such a body develop? I think we have to be clear that if there is, on the one hand, a leap which workers take from fighting on their own behalf with their own form of organisation, not through some organisation of the removal like the Labour Party, fighting for political demand, if that's a characteristic of the Workers' Council, it's also not the case that economic issues and economic demands lose their importance. In fact, they gain in importance, and economic forms of organisation, trade union organisation and so on, don't disappear from the workers' horizon in the period of an uprising revolutionary crisis, in the period of the formation of workers' councils. Always we have to remember anyway, workers' councils are the products of crises in capitalism. Immense pressure on workers' living standards, on their whole life, in the case of, sometimes in the case of war and so on, their very lives themselves. So issues to do with wages and hours of work and conditions of work and rights of trade union organisation and all of those sorts of issues remain crucial in the development of the Workers' Council. And a fight on those sorts of issues, on economic issues, is absolutely central to the development and spread of the Workers' Council from the place where it starts. Because always there's one place, a revolutionary capital. Donny Gluckstein, who's taught how to really like to be at who's talking about Turin, or Russia. He's written a thesis on the Soviets in the First World War, which I think Bookmarks are going to be publishing sometime over the next 6 months or so. And he's quite right, he says, in every case, when you look at the development of workers' councils, there's a particular city with a particularly strong industrial working class base which provides the starting point for the formation of the Soviet, for the formation of workers' councils. It was Petrograd in 1905, it was Petrograd in 1917, it was Gdansk in Poland, it was Berlin in Germany, it was Turin in Italy, it was Budapest in Hungary, and so on and so on and so on. Now, if the Workers' Council is going to grow and spread, then actually it grows and spreads partly through workers in other cities taking up those political demands, but it also spreads through other means, through the economic struggle, deepening. All the things that Rosa Luxemburg wrote about in the mass strike, about the interplay between the economic and political struggle, affect the form as well. The Workers' Council emerges everywhere to fight for economic demands as well. If it doesn't do so, as a matter of fact, the movement is doomed. Because that's one of the means by which the more backward sections of workers first move into action, fighting for economic demands, beginning to have a sense of their strength for the first time, perhaps, to organise into a union. Unorganised workers join unions in the period when other workers are already advancing towards the revolutionary seizure of power. The whole class moves, but at different tempos. There's an unevenness in the development of the working class always, and it's also experienced in the period of revolutionary crises. And of course, the extent to which, in fact, those demands are developed, the more backward workers are encouraged to form unions, to strike for the first time, to join in the Workers' Council movement and so on. The extent to which that happens is partly a function of political organisation. Revolutionaries will not simply have to focus all their attention in such a period in the future, which we all look forward to, simply on the Workers' Council in London, the Workers' Council in Birmingham, or whatever. We will also have to consider trade union organisation for the first time, perhaps in, I don't know, I may be insulting somebody, a Maidenhead, or lower or something. If the Workers' Council does not keep fighting on trade union demands, on economic demands, actually it loses its base. It's one of the tragedies of solidarity in 1981. That when workers were fighting for economic demands in the summer and autumn of 1981, solidarity had lost contact with the need to fight on economic demands. It was one of the finally solidarity weakening itself in the period before the coup precisely throughout. This is subject from reputation. There is an enormous impetus given to the whole society, an enormous shake-up created in the whole of society by the very existence of workers' councils. Because a strike by miners, or a strike of workers in a particular industry, can catch the imagination, perhaps, of some workers in solidarity. But when we're talking about a workers' council, we're talking about something which is much more fundamental and much more threatening to the whole social order. We're also talking about something which can catch the imaginations and the hopes and the dreams of millions of people who are outside industry. I mean, there are not so many. I mean, Britain is probably perhaps almost the most proletarianised country in the world. But you talk about many countries in the world in which Soviets, workers' councils have emerged, large peasantries, petty bourgeoisies, and so on and so on. In every case, the workers' council has an effect, echo effect, outside the working class, the strict working class itself, if you like. It is characteristic that students, for example, become involved and reform their organisation, but students naturally are drawn in with their own forms of organisation and drawn into the council form. we will see not simply workers' councils emerging in Britain in the period of the Revolution, but also student councils, university councils, college councils, and, very importantly, school councils. School children also. You look at 1968 in France, which was a movement with perhaps revolutionary possibility, not the exciting revolutionary possibility, the role of school children, and that was crucial. Similarly, in Portugal in 1975, also to some degree in Chile, and certainly in Poland, peasants form their own organisations. The possibilities of space is created for the first time by the activity of workers for peasants also to form their own organisations, fighting against their own exploitation and oppression, certainly artisans, even small shopkeepers. And of course, all kinds of community groups, old age pensioners and so on. This is a form which is infinitely expandable. One of the slogans on the Gdansk shipyard gates was, "Workers of all factories unite," which is not a bad slogan. It's very interesting. It's a Polish factory. In principle, there was no reason in principle why a delegate had arrived from Seattle to the Gdansk Inter-Factory Strike Committee. They shouldn't have accepted it. Oh good, somebody else is here from another factory. Our slogan is, "Workers of all factories unite." Similarly, peasant delegates started to come to the workers' councils in 1905 and 1917. Soldiers' delegates, police delegates, believe it or not, from it. Some of them will start to form police councils against the authorities and the police and so on. All that is a necessary part of the development of the revolution. Because the council form is an open form. It's capable of expansion. It's capable of breaking the narrow limits of reformism, the narrow limits of trade unionism, the narrow limits of the Labour Party, and so on. You have a smell of it, a tiny little smell of it in the miners' strike. In the fact that women became involved in the miners' strike in a way that many of us, I don't think any of us, unless we're extremely old, can remember that sort of thing happening. It's pretty history. I haven't seen the newspaper before. I was asking Colin, I believe it is the case the NUN this week has accepted women into associate membership of the NUN. The impact of, did they lose it? They lost it. Okay, they lost it. They didn't break through. You can see that even so, even that the issue should be raised, even through a big strike like that the normal boundaries of membership and so on can even be questioned in a way that we wouldn't have imagined possible before. Now, the existence of workers' councils always involves the creation of a revolutionary situation. If you have workers' councils, you have a revolutionary situation. I think without exception in history. You can talk about mass strikes which are not, general strikes which are not in any sense revolutionary, like the Belgian general strike of 19 or whatever it was. Every time you see the emergence of workers' councils, you have a revolutionary situation, in the sense that the ruling class cannot rule in the old way, and clearly the working class is not willing to be ruled in the old way, which was Lenin's classic definition of a revolutionary situation. The emergence of workers' councils involves a fantastic crisis, obviously for the consciousness and confidence of workers, a marvellous crisis for workers, but it is a desperate crisis for every ruling class. Because always workers' councils from the beginning begin to take away the power of the ruling class, the control of the ruling class. Not over everything initially, but always over something. In Gdansk, for example, they took over control of the food supply. Not all the food supplies, but some of them. The trains and the trams continued to run in Gdansk, although they were on strike. And they had posters on their trains and trams saying, "We are on strike, but we are continuing to serve the public." We're continuing under instruction from the strike committee. Lorries and transport start to move around again with permits from the Workers' Council. It's the beginnings of the movement towards power on the part of workers' organisation. And it isn't because ideologically workers say, we are going to take power, it becomes a necessity for the organisation of a mass strike, that workers should start to think about the organisation of food supplies, of transport, and so on. But nonetheless, it is beginning to take away from the ruling class the control of society, the control of the economy, and ultimately the control of politics. You have a situation, in other words, the beginnings of dual power. Two rival kinds of organisations, the old state organisations and the new, potentially worker state organisations, in rivalry over the question of who is to run society. Therefore, there's a massive heightening of class antagonisms in society, and there's no question in such a situation, faced with that kind of situation, any ruling class anywhere will struggle with everything in its power, and some of the instruments of its power are just fallen out of its power. It's one of the characteristics of it, but it will struggle to regain control, to smash the workers' councils, because they're incompatible with the normal function of capitalism. And therefore, always the emergence of workers' councils, in a sense, is a signal that there is a decisive test of strength coming between the working class and the ruling class, which, the outcome of that can shape the world for a whole generation or more. Now, in that kind of situation, you have to ask, who is the key enemy as far as revolutions are concerned? Now, obviously, the ruling class. But in practical terms, you have to say the worst enemy of the revolution at that moment are reformers. Why? Because the first slogan of reaction in such a situation is not fascism. It is not extreme right-wing smashing of workers' organisations. Rather, much more dangerous is the demand that the workers' councils should be limited, that they should be subordinated to the trade union bureaucracy, they should be subordinated to Parliament, that they should perhaps exist side by side with Parliament, and so on and so on. You see, there are all sorts of people who classically Marxists are called centrists, from Kautsky in the period of the First World War and after to the late and not very lamented Nikos Koulantzas of the French Communist Party, who argue that socialism is possible with parliaments and workers' councils. The ideal socialism is both parliament and workers' councils. Actually, in practice, you have to say the two forms, parliamentary democracy and workers' council democracy, are not compatible. In fact, they're completely antagonistic. You look in practice at the problem question, and I think it's very clear. The Social Democrats, after all, of Germany were the people responsible for the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. On the right, it was the Social Democrats who organised the murder of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, and who smashed the council, subordinated them and then smashed them. In Germany in 1919. In Spain in 1936, 1937, who smashed the Workers' Council of Barcelona and Aragon and so on? Was it Franco? No, it was not. It was the Communist Party. The Communist Party fought them on the streets, destroyed them, in the interest of defending parliamentary republicanism. In Italy and France, in the immediate post-war crises, 1945, who subordinated the working class back to capital? It was in fact the reformists. You look in Chile, the issue between Allende and the working class, either parliamentarism has to be abandoned, or the working class must be subordinated to the parliamentary struggle. Parliament, you see, I mean, we know the argument, just to remind ourselves very quickly, the parliamentary process always depends upon demobilised, passive workers. Individualised, atomised. That's the central of parliamentary democracy. The way it works is that workers are not organised, not collectively organised, they're individualised and atomised. They have a private relationship with the state once every 5 years, where they go into a booth and register an opinion, sort of between consenting adults and the state. There's this relationship which exists once every 5 years. That's the basis of it. Not collective power, but individualised, atomised. MPs are not delegates, they're not recalled, as we all know too well. The state, the majority of the state system under parliamentary democracy is out of parliamentary control, is certainly out of popular control. And the workers' council system is a completely different system. It is popular democracy. It's workers' control of everything, the election of everybody and the control of everybody and the recallability of everybody. That's not compatible with the parliamentary system. One or other has to triumph. And because, therefore, the development of workers' councils very rapidly provokes a reaction, the defence of workers' councils gives revolutionaries their possibility. Because revolutionaries will be in a minority in the first period of the development of workers' councils. They will be in a small minority. But the struggle over the question of the defence of workers' councils can give revolutionaries the opportunity which the Bolsheviks had in 1917, for example, precisely to defend the revolution against the right. It gave them the opportunity to become the leadership of the revolution. By being the firmest defenders of the revolution, of a limited revolution, they became capable of leading the revolution on to the socialist revolution. And the same, essentially, I think we've every reason to suppose that the same sorts of dynamics, you can imagine the same sorts of dynamics occurring in Sheffield, as occurred in Petrograd in 1917. The question which we would then be having to pose is, how do we fight for all power to the workers' council? How do we fight for it? How do we defend their form? How do we generalise their form? How do we explain the significance of their form, the possibilities of their form to workers? How do we show workers that they must fight to extend this form and to take power through this form? That will become the crucial question in any revolution. And of course, one thing I think we have to say, which, as a matter of fact, the Bolsheviks did not say clearly, not clearly enough, and which is not marked actually with the strictly Bolshevik tradition, which we have to add to the Bolshevik tradition. Because something which the Russian workers never achieved. It isn't simply a question of taking political power. I say there's a fusion of political and economic power, and political and economic questions and political and economic struggles through the Workers' Council. The question of workers' control of industry, economic control of the economy, which actually the Russian workers never achieved in reality. Historically, no working class, historically, has ever taken control of the economy and developed it. It remains one of the achievements which the working class has to make in this. We can imagine it, but actually, historically, there is no sense in which we can really say that the workers of any country have taken control of the economy and revived an economy under their own control, say to the level of the Western capital. Because that becomes the urgent question. It hasn't happened yet. And that becomes a crucial part of the development of the Workers' Council. Not only is it a question of the taking of power, political power, it's also a question of the taking by workers of economic power, the taking over of the factories, of all the workplaces, of the economy as a whole, and running it under their own democratic control. Now, just to conclude, two things, I think. The first one, I think it should already be clear, that in the question of revolution, the question of revolutionary organisation is absolutely crucial, is absolutely vital. It is an inescapable necessity of every revolution that there should be an effective revolutionary party. It's true that the possibilities for revolutionaries, in a revolutionary crisis, needless to say, are enormously expanded. The development of workers' councils in Britain will make life a lot easier for us. Believe it or not, the paper will sell more easily, we'll have more people listening to us, we will grow, and this. On the other hand, the costs of failure in such a period are absolutely dire and disastrous. The Russian Revolution was probably defeated by 1920, 21. You choose your date, but in real terms, in terms of it being a working class controlled society, it was all over by the end of the Civil War. So we have not got over it yet, that defeat of 1917 to 1920, for the isolation of the Russian Revolution. And the dire consequences of defeat can be for a whole generation or more. So the decisive role of a revolutionary party, the question of a revolutionary party, in its ability to lead in such a situation, is absolutely crucial. The second thing, of course, which has to be said is that the isolation of the Workers' Council in a particular place is their death. Paris Commune, 1871, defeated before it had spread to the rest of France. Petrograd, in July of 1917, there was a possibility that the most militant and advanced workers would take power in Petrograd in advance of the rest of the Russian working class, in which case they would have been isolated and defeated. One of the reasons why the Bolsheviks pulled the movement back and put themselves into terrible difficulty and danger in the process was that the movement was not ready for power yet, because it hadn't spread enough. And there was a danger that Petrograd could be another Paris, we could have another tragedy of 1871. In Turin, in 1919-1920, fantastic communist workers' movement in the factories, but Turin was isolated from the rest of Italy, and there was no political mechanism through which the militancy of the Turin workers could be translated to the rest of Italian society. You look at the Russian Revolution, consider the Russian Revolution as a whole, a Soviet state created, but it was isolated in the world and degenerated in the horrors of there. So the revolution has to spread, and the Soviet form has to spread, or it will die. I mean, Marx wrote in